Is Cote d'Ivoire on the brink of a new civil war? More than 2 weeks after a disputed presidential election, the world's largest cocoa producer is still facing chaos and confusion as rival leaders continue to claim their right to the presidency. Dozens have been killed in street protests, and the violence is threatening to spread beyond the main city, Abidjan. Can the UN mission on the ground prevent a full war? And what can the international community do to resolve the stalemate? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Folibat Thibault. Two presidents and multiple paradoxes. The main one being that the legitimate president-elect Alassane Ouattara has sworn himself in unconstitutionally, while the defeated incumbent Laurent Gbagbo has refused to relinquish power. The presidential vote in Cote d'Ivoire was intended to reunify the country after a 2002 civil war, but violence is now threatening to plunge the West African nation into another conflict. All this in a country that was once the economic hub of the continent. Emeka Omolu has a story.
He's holed up in a hotel, but supporters of Cote d'Ivoire's opposition leader have been out in force this week. In one of the latest protests, hundreds of people tried to storm state television offices, but are driven back by army gunfire. A confrontation that leaves more than a dozen dead. The man protesters believe was stripped of the presidency is also refusing to back down. Alassane Ouattara is enjoying the protection of UN peacekeepers at this hotel. And while he may have the support of the international community, in Cote d'Ivoire he appears to have few resources. Ouattara is the man the Election Commission says won 54% of the vote in November's presidential runoff. Within a day of the result being announced, the country's highest court overruled it. Citing fraud, it announced Laurent Gbagbo will remain president. The US, France and the UN all say the initial result should be respected. But Laurent Gbagbo, who's been in power for 10 years, continues to defy calls to step down. He enjoys the support of the army, police and state media. And taking the initial election result as a gauge, he also has the backing of more than 40% of voters. Many in this group believe the political standoff is being whipped up by former colonial power France and the UN in a bid to control the world's largest cocoa producer. With feelings running high on both sides, the prospect of a wider conflict now hangs over Cote d'Ivoire. Emeka Omolu for Inside Story.
So why is more violence a real possibility, and what are the wider global implications? We'll be talking through all these issues and more with our guests in just a few minutes. But first, let's look at how things are escalating. Gun battles have spread from the commercial capital Abidjan to the town of Tibisu. It lies on the line that virtually splits the country in two. UN and French troops patrol this buffer zone and have been doing so ever since a civil war that ended between 2004 and 2005. Now, in the north are rebels loyal to opposition leader Alassane Ouattara. In the south, government forces backing President Laurent Gbagbo. These are the two sides that fought for hours in Tibisu on Thursday. So is Cote d'Ivoire tilting towards a new civil war, or can the crisis be settled peacefully? Joining us for today's discussion are our guests in Paris, François Ndengwe. He's the founder of the African Advisory Board. Here in Doha, Sylvain Touati, he's a research fellow on Africa for the French Institute for International Affairs. And in London, Ayo Johnson, he's the editor of Viewpoint Africa. Gentlemen, thank you all for being on the program today. Thanks for joining us. Now, let me start with you, François Ndengwe in Paris. The opposition had warned of civil war in Cote d'Ivoire if Laurent Gbagbo was to stay in power. Is that where we're headed, you think?
This is really a possibility, but everything must be done to avoid this. I think we are always almost at the verge of a new civil war, and this is not what is needed in Cote d'Ivoire today. We have a very complicated situation. This is unprecedented, but all the forces should unite in order to avoid going into another war.
Ayo Johnson in London, what are your thoughts on the situation? Do you think a bloodbath can be avoided?
Well, we'd hope not. I mean, that's the worst possible scenario. The position we find ourselves is very unconstitutional. It's exemplary. I mean, we've never seen this position before to do with Cote d'Ivoire. And I think both leaders have to show maturity. But we should listen to the will of the people. And it would appear that Mr. Gbagbo has refused to accept the results for what it truly was, instead accepting what has been endorsed to him through the courts. But nonetheless, it's a very difficult and sticky position, and what's at stake purely is the presidency itself, and more so the control of that country. And the large numbers of people, especially the population as a whole, are the ones who are suffering. They're the ones who are not getting value for money. They're the ones that clearly are not getting a government that can actually deliver for them. And they clearly are not, their will and their voices have clearly not been heard.
Well, let's focus more on the political situation if we can. Sylvain Touati, Laurent Gbagbo currently is in control of the army as well as the cocoa, oil and other main revenues of the country. On the other hand, you have Alassane Ouattara, who's got the backing of the international community of France, the United Nations, the United States, and ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States as well. Who do you think has the upper hand right now?
I think definitely the upper hand is in the hand of Laurent Gbagbo, in the sense that the control of Abidjan is one of the main issues for both of the leader. They need to control the administration, they need to control the radio, the TV, and at the moment Gbagbo has all of them, and that's the purpose of all the protests launched by Alassane Ouattara yesterday and today, is to take control of the administration. He has to put in place his government. At the moment he has only have the control of one hotel in Abidjan, and that's where we can call it the Battle of Abidjan. Who is going to gain control of the city? And
so far, Laurent Gbagbo, the incumbent president, seems to be winning that Battle of Abidjan, as you call it. Well, the international community, as we've been saying, has been weighing in a lot on this crisis. French President Nicolas Sarkozy has had the toughest warning yet. Speaking in Brussels on Friday, Sarkozy said Laurent Gbagbo should stand down by the end of this week. Let's take a listen.
Laurent Gbagbo and his wife have their fate in their hands. If Laurent Gbagbo has not quit before the end of the week, the post he holds is in violation of the will of the Ivorian people. They will be put on the sanctions list by name.
Now, Sylvain Touati, we know that the relationship between Gbagbo and France has been somewhat uneasy since 2002. Is Laurent Gbagbo, in your opinion, likely to heed France's call, ever to heed France's call to stand down, or could he be more emboldened by this call and rather stay in power just because he wants to defy France?
I think that Laurent Gbagbo is not going to listen to the France call from Nicolas Sarkozy. It's one of the rhetorical speech of Laurent Gbagbo is to say that the recognition of Ouattara as president is an international plot organized against him and has been kind of planned. So the fact that this kind of speech from Nicolas Sarkozy, or international leader, are reinforcing his speech, his position towards his partisan. He has been saying during all the campaign that he's going to win the election, and if he's not, he's still going to win. So he has been planning this situation. Laurent Gbagbo is a fine strategist. He knows what he's doing. He knew the situation could lead this kind of situation. So I think the international community needs more than speech to get his attention.
Well, Ayo Johnson, as Sylvain just said there, Gbagbo has dismissed the international community's support for Ouattara and their calls for him to stand down as interference, foreign interference, basically a violation of Cote d'Ivoire's sovereignty. Is he right in saying this?
To an extent, yes. Especially the colonial masters, it always gives a bad taste in the mouth, if one were to say so. But nonetheless, it's a correct call for him to step down. It's a correct call for his party to start thinking correctly. But nonetheless, I think the international community, the European Union, ECOWAS, and the African Union have to show their voices, and they've been doing so. So I think the more countries around the world that clearly show their weight and their dismay at the election in terms of the results, and more so the fact that Mr. Mr. Gbagbo is refusing to relinquish power, I think that would apply added pressure on him to comply. But nonetheless, I think the smart sanctions are the ones which are going to be much more effective. The effect on their bank account, the ability to travel,
but so far the sanctions,
and of course
the sanctions, I'm sorry to interrupt you, the sanctions imposed so far, notably by the European Union, aren't really directed towards Laurent Gbagbo himself. I mean, how effective are these sanctions likely to be when the man that they're supposed to be targeting isn't even being targeted by the sanctions?
That's just the point I was trying to make, that the sanctions have got to be specific to him himself and his inner circle, rather than broad blanket as it's clearly being shown currently. And I think if it starts to hurt their pockets, if it starts to hurt them personally, then they will reconsider. But I think Mr. Gbagbo has to realize that the chips are on the table. At the moment, it's very difficult. He's got to comply to international pressure, and only if international consensus is applied and targeted directly at him and his inner elite, then maybe we could see a situation where we could have a reversal. But moving forward, I think the examples that we saw in Kenya, the examples that we saw in Zimbabwe through their elections and their crisis that they had in those countries only lend me to think that clearly we're moving into a coalition government of some description. Well, that's the only means of getting out of this problem. Well,
we'll talk about the means of getting out of the crisis in just a minute, but I want to talk more about what's been happening over the last 2 weeks in Abidjan. We've seen the army, François Ndenge, backing Laurent Gbagbo so far, and that probably is what gives him the upper hand in this crisis, because he's got the army behind him. How long do you think it will be until, you know, they decide, because of the pressure of the international community, that they no longer want to back Laurent Gbagbo?
It's difficult to answer this kind of question, because the army has been very faithful to Laurent Gbagbo up to now, and they show us they're emboldened by the issue of sovereignty and playing the card of defending the Cote d'Ivoire sovereignty. But in a situation like this, we have to look back at what happened. In my view, there have been at least 2 major mistakes regarding these elections. I wonder whether it was the right to go to the elections when the country was divided into 2, with one part of the country still being controlled by the rebels who still had their guns. I wonder whether it was very fair to go to the election in this situation.
Sylvain Touati, do you agree with that? I see you nodding your head there. Do you think this was the wrong time to go to elections in Ivory Coast, even though the elections have been delayed, what, several times, 5 times since the civil war? This was perhaps not the right time. This is what François is saying in Paris. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't agree. Of course, it would be good if the election organized in a perfect timing and a perfect situation. But the problem is the war has been started for more than 8 years now. The situation has been going on for 8 years. The 2 parties have been working on this issue of the election. Laurent Gbagbo decided to go to the elections this time. And so that's something that cannot be said. The election, it would be, of course, nice if the election happened in a unified country, but the situation is the country is not unified today.
So the divisions then that were caused by the war in 2002, and I'm thinking here of the issues of identity, of who's Ivorian, who's not, the issues of wealth distribution. You think those issues, Sylvain, haven't been addressed before this election then?
No, I think they have been addressed. That's one thing that maybe one of the main outcome of this whole crisis in Ivory Coast is now the question of who is Ivorian has been put on the table. It was something that was hidden for many decades, and I think a lot of debate have been going on. I'm not sure the result of this debate is going to be appreciated by all the parts, but I think there is a move. Both sides, I think, they think the Ivorian. No one wants to split the country. That's why people who are saying that the country is going to be split in 2 is not. I don't think it's going to happen. I think Ivorian are really likely to keep Cote d'Ivoire as one country. And the situation is really now in Abidjan, who is going to be the president of this country.
Ayo Johnson in London, do you think that this election, which was supposed to restore the country's democratic credentials, do you think that perhaps Ivory Coast is just not simply ready for democracy?
Well, clearly they've shown that they're not ready and they're not mature enough. But I think it was essential that it happened. I mean, we were 6 years into a presidency which should have stopped much earlier in the process. So clearly the Ivorians wanted elections. Clearly they wanted a unified decision. And it's unfortunate that we find ourselves in this position. But it shows that the Electoral Commission was not mature enough. It makes an entire mockery of the process itself. And it holds the entire country into ransom, especially in the position they find themselves. So on balance, I would say they were not ready for elections, but elections had to go ahead simply because we were so delayed 6 years on, since the election should have happened 6 years earlier.
Francois Ndengwe in Paris, I just want to give a bit of background perhaps to our viewers who are not necessarily familiar with the political scene in Ivory Coast. This is a country that was once hailed as a beacon of democracy in West Africa, of stability in West Africa. What are the underlying causes of this crisis today?
You know that the Cote d'Ivoire was not only a very important country in terms of the policy and the politics, but it was also, and it still is, the biggest country in terms of the GDP of the West African CFA zones. It's account to around 40%. So this is a big country. What are the underlying causes? I think I'm coming back to the issues of the rebellion and the fact that the country was divided. And I've just heard from Sylvain that President Gbagbo was the one who wanted elections. If this is true, I think this was a great mistake on his part. You cannot go to elections when a country is divided and the other people are still holding their weapons. And you've seen that the discussion, the disputes, has just arisen about the places that was held by the rebels. So this is the past. Now we're facing a very difficult situation. This is a very confrontational situation. And on the other hand, on the other side, I don't think that we should create a precedent. I mean by that, if we want to stick to the law of a country, we must look exactly what are these laws. If the law is saying that the president is by the Constitutional Court, I mean the highest court, is say this is the new president.
Right.
And if the international community comes now and say this is not the new president, I'm not saying this. I'm not saying that this court is right. I'm just saying that we don't want to set a precedent in Africa. And on the other side, the Ouattara side, they're in their rights. But what they must do, in my view, is to avoid a bloody confrontation.
Right.
They should be allowed to protest, of course, but
the whole idea, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but again, the whole idea, sorry to interrupt you, you say they should avoid confrontation and so on. And as you reiterated, the international community has been watching the situation in Ivory Coast very closely because, again, this is the world's largest cocoa producer and cocoa prices have skyrocketed in recent weeks because of the crisis in the country. Let's just take a listen now to some of the other international condemnation of Laurent Gbagbo's decision to remain in power.
There was a successful presidential election with over 81% participation. Except for the last-minute confusion about its results, there is no reason for us to remain confused because the will of the people, as expressed on the 28th of November, is irrefutable.
The results declared by the Electoral Commission and accepted by the UN Special Representative there is the authentic one, and Ouattara is the person that will support as the president of Cote d'Ivoire. It's immediate. Elections have been declared. Somebody has won. So he has to hand over.
It is a time for President Gbagbo to recognize the will of the people of Cote d'Ivoire and embark on a peaceful transition. So it's not something, the United States is calling on the president to respect the will and a clear, decisive victory by Mr. Ouattara.
All right, so the U.S., the EU, the Economic Community of West African States, all calling on Laurent Gbagbo to step down in Cote d'Ivoire. Sylvain Touati, beyond the condemnation, beyond the sanctions, what can the international community really do to resolve the stalemate?
Behind the sanction, I think there is forces on the field. They need to be there to protect the population. After what we saw yesterday, maybe the UN peacekeeping mission needs to be more present in Abidjan and try to avoid affrontment between the two sides. Honestly,
but is the UN peacekeeping mission likely to intervene if the situation were to degenerate, in your opinion?
If we see like more and more affrontment like yesterday and bloodbaths, I think that's one of the things that there's going to be more and more pressure on the international peacekeeping mission to intervene, at least to be in between the two sides. But at the same time, there will be also more and more pressure from some of the members of the international community to maybe back to Ouattara sides. I don't think it's something that should be done, but the UN has been on the field for more than 8 years. They have been monitoring this election, the whole process. I think the representatives of the UN on the field make it clear that the electoral process was going fine. Now it's the end of the crisis needs to end in Cote d'Ivoire, and the international community is already deployed on the field, and they recognize a special result. Maybe the next step is to put Ouattara in power.
Ayo Johnson in London, do you think that the UN can prevent a full-scale war in Cote d'Ivoire? We've seen a UN presence in the Democratic Republic of Congo, for instance, strong presence there, but the crisis there continues. Can they do anything in Cote d'Ivoire if the situation again were to degenerate?
Well, it all depends on the mandates by which they want to operate by. You've seen, as you mentioned there in the Congo, where they've actually got the largest contingency of peacekeeping forces on the ground, and it hasn't delivered. So it all depends on the mandate. It depends on the will. It depends on how welcome they're invited into the Cote d'Ivoire to start with, and if their mandate is to protect, then that's all they will do. If they have a strong, robust mandate that allows them to be far more confrontational, then we could see a situation where they could be far more robust in their approach. But again, there's always the possibility that it could make the situation far worse. It could antagonize both the entire situation, and of course the rebels in the north could galvanize, and if they were to take on the soldiers in the south, it could be detrimental for the people of Cote d'Ivoire. So on balance, I think there's a need for the African Union, the United Nations, and more internationally for everyone to put their heads down and try and see how they can resolve this. It's difficult around, I'd say.
Francois Ndengwe in Paris, how do you think you can resolve this crisis? Do you think that a national unity government, like we saw in Kenya after the 2007 post-election violence there, can that work in Cote d'Ivoire?
I don't think that a national unity government could work. And if there is an election, there is a winner, the winner should govern. The government of national unities with people of different and opposite views, opposite political views, pulling on different sides could not work. And you know that you have this experience in Kenya, you have the same experience more or less in Zimbabwe. So let the winner and the winner go ahead with his programs and implement his programs. And here too, the Africans and the African Union and even the ECOWAS, they should not just come down and say this is the winner. We should think beyond what had happened in Cote d'Ivoire. We know that the constitution is what it is, and the Africans should think about and for other countries, because this could happen in other countries.
Indeed.
How are we going to avoid this sort of problems? These are the major issues that we should begin to think about in order to avoid these same situations in other African countries.
Sylvain Touati, you have the last word. How do you think this crisis can be resolved in Cote d'Ivoire? And I put the same question to you. Do you think that a national unity government between President Laurent Gbagbo and the former Prime Minister Alassane Ouattara could work?
That's a proposition made by Mr. Ouattara when he was elected. He says that he was going to work with Gbagbo's partisan. But the thing is, we just come out of a unity government. Obviously, it didn't work. He organized the election, but both sides didn't recognize. We just had a unity government in Cote d'Ivoire for many years with Guillaume Soro as a prime minister. The result of the election shows that the country was still not ready, or both sides were not ready to accept the decision of the electoral process. So I don't think the unity government is going to be an answer to the situation. I don't think either of the sides wants to go to the unity government. So unfortunately, I think there will be more and more risk to have the crisis to scale up in the coming weeks.
All right, gentlemen, thank you very much. Fascinating discussion. Of course, it'll be interesting to see how the situation evolves in Cote d'Ivoire in the coming days. Thank you so much for taking part in this edition of Inside Story. In Paris, Francois Ndengwe. In London, Ayo Johnson. And here in Doha, Sylvain Toiti. Of course, we thank you as well for taking part, and we welcome your comments and suggestions as always. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks for watching.